The courtroom was suffocating as Judge Harrison's gavel crashed down, sealing Detective James Morrison's fate. Guilty. The word echoed through the silent chamber, each syllable hammering another nail into his coffin. A decorated officer with 20 years of distinguished service, James sat motionless, his weathered face a mask of disbelief as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The evidence had been overwhelming. Security footage, witness testimonies, and a mountain of circumstantial evidence, all pointing to his involvement in a series of drug-related bribes. But James knew the truth. He'd been framed. The weight of the verdict crushed him, but it wasn't the prospect of prison that tore at his soul. It was the thought of leaving behind Shadow, his loyal canine partner of 8 years. The Belgian Malinois sat in the back of the courtroom, his amber eyes fixed intently on James, muscles tense as if ready to spring into action at any moment. Through countless drug busts, life-threatening situations, and quiet nights on patrol, Shadow had been more than just a police dog. He'd been James's anchor, especially after losing his wife Sarah to cancer 3 years ago. As the judge prepared to deliver the sentence, James could feel Shadow's unwavering gaze burning into him. They'd been through everything together: the sleepless nights after Sarah's passing, the dangerous undercover operations that led to this moment, and the countless times Shadow's keen instincts had saved both their lives. Now, watching his partner's rigid posture and alert expression, James felt a different kind of pain, knowing their bond would be severed by steel bars and concrete walls. "Detective Morrison," Judge Harrison's voice cut through the tension, "before I pronounce your sentence, do you have anything to say?" James slowly rose to his feet, his chains rattling in the silence. His voice, usually commanding and confident, came out barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, I stand before you today, convicted of crimes I didn't commit, but I'm not asking for mercy for myself." He paused, swallowing hard. "I have only one request. Please, let me say goodbye to Shadow." The courtroom erupted in hushed whispers. Judge Harrison's stern gaze shifted between James and the Belgian Malinois, who had risen to his feet, tail straight, ears forward. After what felt like an eternity, the judge nodded. "Given your years of service and Shadow's role as your partner, I'll grant this request. You have 5 minutes." As soon as the handler released Shadow's leash, the dog bounded forward, his nails clicking rapidly against the polished floor. James dropped to his knees, ignoring the bite of cold handcuffs as Shadow pressed against him, whining softly. "I'm sorry, boy," James whispered, burying his face in Shadow's thick fur. "I'm so sorry." The dog's familiar scent, a mixture of leather, fresh air, and something uniquely Shadow, brought tears to his eyes. But suddenly Shadow's behavior changed. His body went rigid, and his nose began working frantically, sniffing at James's suit jacket with increasing urgency. The dog's whines turned to sharp, insistent barks that echoed off the courtroom walls. "What's going on?" Judge Harrison demanded, leaning forward in his chair. Shadow's barking grew more intense as he pawed at James's chest pocket. His training. Taking over, Officer Chen, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward cautiously. "Your Honor, Shadow's giving his alert signal, the same one he uses when detecting evidence during searches." With the judge's permission, Chen approached James and carefully reached into his suit pocket. The courtroom collectively held its breath as Chen withdrew a tiny black object no larger than a USB drive. District Attorney Victoria Reed, who had prosecuted the case against James, suddenly stood up, her face draining of color. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the proceedings. The defendant has already been found guilty." But Shadow's continued barking drowned out her protests. The dog's stance was unmistakable to anyone familiar with canine work. This wasn't just random behavior, this was years of training in action. Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed as he studied the small device. "Officer Chen, what exactly are we looking at?" Chen turned the object over in his hands, his expression growing increasingly troubled. It appears to be some kind of modified recording. Device, Your Honor, very sophisticated, the kind used in covert operations. James stared at the device, his mind racing. He'd never seen it before, had no idea how it had gotten into his jacket pocket. But as he watched Shadow's unwavering alert posture, a glimmer of hope began to spark in his chest. Throughout their years together, Shadow's instincts had never been wrong, not once. The judge's chambers grew silent as all eyes fixed on the mysterious device. Even the usually composed district attorney Reed seemed to fidget uncomfortably, her manicured nails drumming against the prosecution table. Shadow remained at attention, his training keeping him focused on the potential evidence he'd discovered, while James felt his heart pounding against his ribs. Could this seemingly insignificant device hold the key to proving his innocence? The tension in the courtroom was electric as Judge Harrison cleared his throat. In light of this unexpected development, I'm ordering this device to be examined immediately by the court's technical experts. Officer Chen, please secure the evidence. Detective Morrison will be returned to holding while we investigate this matter further. As the bailiffs moved to escort James away, he caught one last glimpse of Shadow, still standing proud and alert, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken understanding. Whatever was on that device, Shadow had just changed everything. The metallic clang of the holding cell door echoed through the empty corridor as James sank onto the cold bench, his mind replaying every moment that had led to this point. 8 years ago, when he'd first been paired with Shadow, he'd had no idea how deeply this partnership would transform his life. Back then, he'd been struggling to find his footing again after a difficult undercover operation had left him questioning his path in law enforcement. Shadow had arrived at the K9 training facility as a young, energetic Belgian Malinois with intelligence burning in his amber eyes. From their first training session together, James had sensed something special about this dog. While other K9s were competent and well-trained, Shadow possessed an almost uncanny ability to read situations and react with precision that went beyond mere training. Their first major case together had cemented their bond. It was a humid summer night when they'd responded to a kidnapping, a 6-year-old girl taken from her bedroom. The other officers had already searched the abandoned warehouse district, finding nothing. But Shadow had picked up a scent that others had missed, leading them through a maze of decrepit buildings to a locked basement door. The girl had been found unharmed, and Shadow's keen instincts had earned him a commendation. That case had been just the beginning. Through the years, they'd developed a silent language of their own, reading each other's subtle cues in high-pressure situations. Shadow knew when James was tense before anyone else could tell, and James had learned to trust Shadow's instincts. Implicitly, the dog had an almost supernatural ability to sense when something wasn't right, a talent that had saved both their lives more times than James could count. When Sarah got sick 3 years ago, Shadow had been there too. The long nights at the hospital, the quiet mornings when James couldn't bring himself to get out of bed, Shadow had remained a constant, steady presence. The dog would lay his head on James's lap, those intelligent eyes somehow conveying more understanding than any human words could offer. After Sarah passed, it was Shadow who had given James a reason to keep going, to maintain their routine of early morning runs and long shifts protecting the streets they'd sworn to serve. Now, sitting in the holding cell, James's thoughts drifted to the case that had led to his downfall. It had started 6 months ago with a series of high-profile drug busts that had seemed routine at first. Shadow had been instrumental in each operation, his nose leading them to significant catches of heroin and cocaine. But something had felt off about the whole operation. The tips coming in too perfectly timed, the suspects too easily caught. James had started asking questions quietly at first. Why were certain areas of the city suddenly hotbeds of activity? How were the drug runners always one step ahead of regular patrols, but seemingly blind to their targeted operations? He'd begun keeping detailed notes, tracking patterns that didn't add up. Then, 2 weeks ago, everything had changed. He remembered the morning clearly. Shadow had been unusually agitated during their patrol, something James had rarely seen in their years together. That same afternoon, Internal Affairs had shown up at his desk with a warrant. They'd found evidence suggesting he'd been taking bribes to protect certain drug operations while busting others. Security footage showed someone who looked like him accepting packages in dark alleys. Bank records revealed mysterious deposits he'd never made. It was a perfectly crafted web of lies, but lies nonetheless. The sound of footsteps in the corridor pulled James from his memories. Through the bars, he could see Officer Chen approaching, his face troubled. "Morrison," Chen said quietly, glancing over his shoulder. "Shadow's been acting strange since they took you away. Won't eat, keeps whining at your old desk. Sarah, Officer Mitchell, she's looking after him, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. James felt his throat tighten. Sarah Mitchell had been his wife's best friend, and she'd helped him through some of his darkest days after the loss. She was one of the few officers who had openly questioned the evidence against him. "Tell her to keep him close," James replied, his voice rough. "Shadow knows something's wrong. He always knows." Chen nodded, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice further. "Listen, that device he found in your jacket, the tech team's working on it now. But Morrison, someone's trying to rush the examination, push it through before they can do a proper analysis. The DA's office is pressing to proceed with sentencing, despite the new evidence." James stood up, moving closer to the bars. "They're scared," he realized aloud. "Whatever's on that device, they don't want it coming out." The pieces were starting to fall into place. The rushed investigation, the perfectly crafted evidence, the pressure to conclude the case quickly. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to frame him, and they weren't about to let a dog's discovery unravel their plans. Chen glanced nervously down the corridor again. "I've got to go, but Morrison, Shadow's still got your back. We all saw his reaction in that courtroom. That wasn't just a trained response, that was something else." He paused, then added, "Some of us haven't forgotten all the times you two have come through for this department." As Chen's footsteps faded away, James returned to his bench, a new determination building in his chest. Shadow had never been wrong about a case, never failed to find what needed to be found. Whatever was on that recording device, his loyal partner had just thrown a wrench into someone's carefully laid plans. Now, he just had to hope it would be enough to expose the truth before it was too late. The fluorescent lights in the forensics lab cast harsh shadows as technician Marcus Wong hunched over his workstation, the tiny recording device connected to his computer through a series of specialized cables. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing security measures that had been expertly placed within the device's circuitry. Behind him, Judge Harrison and 2 court-appointed observers watched intently, their reflections ghost-like in the dark. "Computer screen. This is unusual," Marcus muttered, his brow furrowing as lines of code scrolled past. "The encryption is military-grade, way beyond what you'd find in standard surveillance equipment. Someone went to a lot of trouble to protect whatever's on here." He paused, adjusting his glasses as another window popped up on his screen. "But there's something else. The device has been recording continuously. It wasn't just planted in Detective Morrison's pocket. It's been actively gathering data." Judge Harrison stepped closer, his usually stern expression now tinged with concern. "How long has it been recording?" The question hung in the air as Marcus checked the timestamps. "Based on the file structure, approximately 2 weeks, right around the time the investigation against Morrison began." The judge's frown deepened at this revelation. As Marcus worked to decrypt the files, Officer Sarah Mitchell stood in the K9 unit's kennel area, watching Shadow pace restlessly in his temporary enclosure. The dog's behavior had been erratic since James's arrest, refusing food, growling at certain officers he'd never had issues with before, and constantly trying to return to James's desk. Sarah had known James and his late wife for years, had seen firsthand the incredible partnership he'd built with Shadow. Now, observing the dog's agitation, she couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow was trying to tell them something more. "Oh, what else do you know, boy?" she whispered, approaching the kennel. Shadow immediately came to the gate, his nose working overtime as he sniffed her uniform. She'd been one of the few officers allowed to handle him besides James, a trust built over years of friendship and shared grief. Shadow's tail was low, his entire body tense, with an energy she'd only seen during their most serious operations. Back in the lab, Marcus's quiet exclamation drew everyone's attention. "I've got it. The first file is decrypting now." He hit a few more keys, and suddenly the lab's speakers crackled to life. Through bursts of static, voices emerged, distant at first but growing clearer. "The evidence is in place," a male voice said, its tone clipped and professional. "Morrison's been asking too many questions. This will shut him up for good." "And you're sure it can't be traced back?" Another voice responded, this one familiar enough to make Judge Harrison lean forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of Marcus's chair. "Everything's clean," the first voice assured. "The security footage is doctored. The bank records are perfect. By the time anyone figures it out, Morrison will be behind bars, and the operation can proceed as planned." The recording continued, revealing a carefully orchestrated conspiracy to frame James Morrison. Names were mentioned, prominent figures in law enforcement and city government, along with details of drug operations and payoffs that went far beyond a simple case of police corruption. As the voices discussed their plans, it became clear that James had stumbled onto something much bigger than anyone had realized. In another part of the building, Sarah had made a decision. Shadow's behavior, combined with her own doubts about the case against James, compelled her to act. With practiced efficiency, she attached Shadow's leash and led him out of the kennel area. "Come on, boy," she whispered. "Let's check something out." They made their way to James's desk, which had been sealed as part of the investigation. Shadow's reaction was immediate and intense. He pulled toward the desk drawers, his nose working frantically, just as it had in the courtroom. Sarah glanced around the empty office before making a decision that could cost her her badge. Using a spare key James had given her years ago for emergencies, she quietly opened the bottom drawer. The drawer contained standard office supplies and personal items, but Shadow's focus was unwavering. His paw scratched at the drawer's back panel, and Sarah noticed something odd. The panel seemed slightly loose. With trembling fingers, she pried it free, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small notebook, its pages filled with James's precise handwriting. Sarah's heart raced as she flipped through the pages. James had documented everything: suspicious patterns in drug busts, inconsistencies in arrest records, names, and dates that painted a picture of widespread corruption. But what caught her eye was a note about a specific operation from 6 months ago. "Shadow refused to give alert at Warehouse 7, James had written. "Handler ordered positive indication. Anyway, something wrong with entire operation." The implications hit her like a physical blow. James hadn't just been asking questions, he'd been building a case. And Shadow, loyal, brilliant Shadow, had known something was wrong even then. The dog hadn't given a false alert because his integrity, like his handlers, couldn't be corrupted. As if confirming her thoughts, Shadow let out a soft whine, pressing against her leg. Sarah quickly photographed every page of the notebook with her phone, then replaced everything exactly as she'd found it. Her mind was already racing ahead to her next move. These photos, combined with whatever was on the recording device, could blow the entire case wide open. Good boy, she whispered to Shadow, scratching behind his ears. You're still on duty, aren't you? Still protecting your partner? Shadow's tail wagged slightly, the first positive response she'd seen from him since James's arrest. They had to move fast now. She knew from experience that evidence had a way of disappearing in cases like this, and somewhere in the building, powerful people were about to discover that their carefully constructed plan was unraveling. Marcus's fingers flew across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of multiple monitors as more decrypted files revealed their secrets. The recording device had captured far more than just incriminating conversations. It contained embedded metadata, GPS coordinates, and system access logs that painted a disturbing picture of organized corruption. "Judge Harrison," Marcus called out, his voice tight with urgency. "You need to see this." He pulled up a series of timestamps that corresponded with major drug busts over the past 6 months. These coordinates match locations where Detective Morrison conducted raids, but look at the access patterns. He pointed to a string of code. Someone was monitoring his movements, tracking his investigation. They knew exactly where he'd be and when. The judge leaned closer, his expression darkening as the implications became clear. "They were playing both sides," he muttered, "using Morrison's legitimate busts as cover while protecting their own operations." Before he could say more, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. His face paled as he read it. "The DA's office is pushing for an immediate transfer. They want Morrison moved to state custody within the hour." Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell hurried through the precinct's corridors, Shadow at her heel, the photographed evidence burning a hole in her phone. She needed to get the information to someone she could trust, but trust had become a scarce commodity. As she rounded the corner toward the forensics lab, she nearly collided with Captain Thomas Reynolds, the department's internal affairs supervisor. "Officer Mitchell," Reynolds said, his tone carefully neutral. "I wasn't aware you had authorization to remove the K9 from the kennel area." His eyes flickered to Shadow, who had gone rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Sarah had never seen Shadow react this way to Reynolds before, and something in the dog's response made her instincts scream danger. "Just maintaining his training schedule, sir," she replied smoothly, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Can't let his skills deteriorate while Detective Morrison's case is pending." She felt Shadow press against her leg, his body language screaming alertness. Reynolds studied them both for a long moment. "Admirable dedication, Mitchell. But I think it's best if we suspend K9 activities until this situation is resolved. Return him to the kennel immediately." His tone left no room for argument, but Sarah couldn't miss the slight tremor in his hand as he gestured down the hallway. As Sarah turned to comply, Shadow suddenly lunged forward, his nose working frantically at Reynolds' briefcase. The captain jerked back, his face flushing with anger. "Control that dog, officer," he snapped, but Shadow's behavior had already caught the attention of several nearby officers, including Chen, who had just emerged from the break room. "Sir," Chen said, stepping forward, Shadow's giving his alert signal again, the same signal that had led to the discovery of the recording device. Reynolds' face went from red to white in an instant. "This is ridiculous," he blustered. "I am your superior officer, and I demand—" "Captain Reynolds," Judge Harrison's voice cut through the tension as he approached from the direction of the forensics lab. "I believe we need to have a conversation about some very interesting recordings we've just reviewed." The judge's eyes settled on Reynolds' briefcase, "and perhaps about the contents of your case as well." Reynolds looked trapped, his eyes darting between the growing crowd of officers, Shadow's unwavering alert stance, and the judge's stern expression. In a sudden burst of movement, he shoved past Chen and bolted down the corridor. He might have made it too, if not for Shadow. Without waiting for a command, the dog launched into action, years of training taking over as he easily caught up to Reynolds, grabbing his leg with just enough pressure to bring him down. The briefcase flew open as Reynolds fell, spilling papers across the floor. Sarah rushed forward, her heart stopping as she saw what lay among the scattered documents: photographs of James conducting his investigation, surveillance logs, and a USB drive labeled with dates matching the warehouse operations James had documented in his notebook. "Your Honor," she called out, pulling out her phone, "I have something you need to see as well." She quickly pulled up the photos of James's notebook, watching as understanding dawned on the judge's face. The evidence was undeniable. Reynolds had been the one monitoring James, feeding information back to whoever was running the corruption ring. Chen and another officer secured Reynolds as Judge Harrison examined the contents of the briefcase. "Get Detective Morrison up here immediately," the judge ordered, "and someone contact the FBI. This just became a federal investigation." He turned to Sarah, his expression grave but approving. "Officer Mitchell, I believe you and Shadow here have just broken this case wide open." Shadow sat alertly by Sarah's side, his eyes fixed on Reynolds as the captain was led away in handcuffs. His posture remained rigid, protective, as if his duty to expose the truth hadn't ended with this discovery. Sarah reached down to scratch his ears, her voice thick with emotion. "Good boy," she whispered. "James would be so proud." The corridor buzzed with activity as federal agents began arriving, but Sarah's mind was already racing ahead. Reynolds' arrest was just the beginning. The evidence in his briefcase, combined with the recorded conversations and James's notes, suggested a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the department. And somewhere in the building, someone was still trying to rush James's transfer to get him out of the way before everything unraveled. Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward, his body tensing again. Sarah had learned to trust his instincts as much as James did, and something told her they weren't done yet. The dog's gaze fixed on the elevator at the end of the hall, and as the doors began to open, Sarah realized this was far from over. The real fight to clear James's name was just beginning. The elevator doors slid open to reveal Assistant District Attorney Marcus Thorne, flanked by two armed transport officers. His usual polished demeanor was cracked, a sheen of sweat visible. On his forehead, as he took in the scene before him, Captain Reynolds in handcuffs, federal agents swarming the corridor, and Shadow standing alertly beside Sarah Mitchell. "This is highly irregular," Thorne announced, his voice carrying a forced authority. "I have a transfer order for Detective Morrison signed by Judge Blackwood. He's to be moved to state custody immediately." He held up a document, but Judge Harrison stepped forward, his expression stern. "That order is suspended, Mr. Thorne," Harrison stated firmly. "New evidence has come to light that significantly impacts this case." As if to emphasize the point, Shadow's ears flattened, and he let out a low growl that made Thorne take an involuntary step back. Sarah watched the ADA's reaction carefully, noting how his eyes darted to Reynolds, then to the scattered contents of the briefcase. She saw the moment realization hit him. The carefully constructed plan was falling apart. Shadow seemed to sense it too, his body coiled with tension as he tracked Thorne's every movement. "Evidence?" Thorne scoffed, but his voice wavered. "A dog's behavior and whatever planted devices you've found don't override a judicial order. Those transport officers are taking Morrison now." He gestured to the armed men beside him, who moved to step forward. That's when Shadow exploded into action. Without warning, he lunged toward one of the transport officers, not to attack, but with the same focused intensity he'd shown with Reynolds' briefcase. The officer stumbled backward, his jacket falling open to reveal a concealed weapon that wasn't standard department issue. "Federal agents!" Judge Harrison barked. "Check their credentials!" The next few moments erupted into chaos. The second transport officer reached for his weapon, but Chen was faster, tackling him to the ground. The first officer turned to run, but Shadow was there, blocking his escape route with fierce determination. As federal agents swarmed in to secure the scene, Sarah's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Marcus in the forensics lab. "The GPS data from the recording device," she read aloud to Judge Harrison. "It shows regular meetings between Captain Reynolds and these transport officers at an abandoned warehouse on the river. The same warehouse where Detective Morrison's K9 unit refused to give a false alert," Harrison finished, remembering the notes from James's notebook. "Officer Mitchell, get Morrison up here now. Mr. Thorne, I suggest you start explaining how unauthorized armed men obtained legitimate transfer papers with Judge Blackwood's signature." Thorne's composed facade crumbled completely. "You don't understand," he stammered, his eyes wild. "They'll kill me if I talk. This goes higher than you know. Judges, commissioners, people who can make anyone disappear." Shadow's posture shifted, subtly, and Sarah recognized the change. He'd caught a scent. The dog moved purposefully toward Thorne, nosing at his expensive leather briefcase. Judge Harrison nodded to a federal agent who took the case despite Thorne's protests. Inside, they found a burner phone with only one number in its contact. A list labeled simply "Commission." "Get cyber forensics on that phone immediately," Harrison ordered, "and someone find out how deep Judge Blackwood's involvement goes." He turned to Sarah. "Officer Mitchell, take 2 federal agents and get Detective Morrison. Don't trust anyone else until we know how far this corruption extends." As Sarah hurried toward the holding cells with Shadow and the agents, her mind raced. The conspiracy was larger than any of them had imagined. Dirty cops, compromised judges, fake transport officers ready to make James disappear before he could expose the truth. If Shadow hadn't alerted to that recording device in the courtroom, they found James pacing in his cell, his face tense with concern. "Sarah," he asked, seeing her approach with the federal agents, "what's happening up there? I heard commotion." Before she could answer, Shadow bounded forward, pressing against the bars to reach his partner. The dog's tail wagged for the first time since James's arrest. "Your partner here just helped expose a conspiracy that goes all the way to the commissioner's office," Sarah explained, as one of the agents unlocked the cell. "Captain Reynolds, ADA Thorne, even Judge Blackwood, they're all involved in a massive corruption ring. Those drug busts you were investigating, they were using your legitimate operations as cover for their own trafficking network." James stepped out of the cell, immediately kneeling to embrace Shadow. "I knew something was wrong," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every time we hit a warehouse, Shadow would give alerts on some shipments but completely ignore others. They tried to force him to false alert, but he wouldn't do it. Would you, boy?" Shadow whined softly, pressing closer to his partner. "They were going to transfer you out today," Sarah continued as they headed back upstairs. "The transport officers were carrying unauthorized weapons. If Shadow hadn't exposed them..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. James's face hardened as he understood how close he'd come to being disappeared. As they emerged from the stairwell, the scene that greeted them was one of controlled chaos. Federal agents were leading Judge Blackwood away in handcuffs. He'd arrived to check on the transfer order only to walk into his own arrest. Phones throughout the building were being confiscated as evidence, and officers were being questioned about their connections to Reynolds and the corruption ring. Shadow stayed close to James, his mission to protect his partner far from over. The dog's keen instincts had not only saved James from a false conviction, but had helped expose a criminal enterprise that had infected every level of law enforcement. As federal agents continued their sweep of the building, Sarah couldn't help but wonder how many more secrets Shadow would help them uncover before this was over. The next few hours unfolded like a whirlwind as federal agents transformed the precinct into a command center for their expanding investigation. James sat in Judge Harrison's chambers, Shadow lying protectively at his feet as he detailed everything he'd uncovered before his arrest. The evidence from Reynolds' briefcase was spread across the judge's desk, along with printouts of the GPS, data from the recording device, and James's recovered notebook. The pattern became clear about 6 months ago, James explained, pointing to a series of dates in his notes. Every time Shadow and I made a major bust, another shipment would slip through somewhere else in the city, but it was more than that. Shadow started acting differently during certain searches, more agitated, like he knew something was wrong. Sarah, who had refused to leave James's side since his release, leaned forward. "That's when they started monitoring you?" James nodded, his face grim. "I noticed surveillance vehicles started catching glimpses of the same faces in different locations. Then, Shadow began reacting to certain officers he'd never had issues with before. That's when I knew it wasn't just random corruption, it was organized." Special Agent Diana Rodriguez of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit studied the evidence with intense focus. "Your canine's behavior changes were the first red flag," she noted, watching as Shadow's ears perked up at her mention of him. "But what made you start documenting everything?" James reached down to scratch Shadow's ears, drawing strength from his partner's presence. "It was a raid at Warehouse 17. Shadow had given clear alerts on several shipping containers, but when we opened them, they were clean, completely clean, not even residual scents that might confuse a dog. That's when I realized they were using our searches as cover, moving their real shipments while we hit empty locations." The door opened and Marcus hurried in, clutching a laptop. "You need to see this," he said, setting up the computer. "I finished analyzing the data from ADA Thorne's burner phone. The number labeled commission. It wasn't just connecting to the police commissioner. It was routing through multiple secure servers, but I managed to trace the endpoints. Some of these calls were going to a private number in City Hall." Judge Harrison's face darkened. "The mayor's office?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Not just the mayor's office. I found financial transfers connecting to offshore accounts, shell companies, all linking back to a development project called Riverside Renaissance. It's a multi-billion-dollar waterfront renovation plan that's been fast-tracked through City Council. The warehouses," James said suddenly, realization dawning. "All the major drug busts, the ones they were using as cover, they were all in the Riverside district. They're not just running drugs, they're using the trafficking operation to force out legitimate businesses, drive down property values, so they can buy up the land cheap for their development project," Sarah finished. "And anyone who gets too close to the truth." She glanced meaningfully at James, leaving the implications unspoken. Shadow suddenly lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his throat seconds before a commotion erupted in the hallway. Agent Rodriguez moved to the door, hand on her weapon. But it was Chen who burst in, his face flushed with urgency. "They're shredding documents in the commissioner's office," he reported breathlessly. "One of the cleaning staff noticed and called it in. Federal agents are heading there now, but..." A series of sharp barks cut him off as Shadow sprang to his feet, practically vibrating with intensity. James looked to Agent Rodriguez. "Shadow's trained in document detection. If they've moved any of those papers..." The federal agent nodded sharply. "Go, take Officer Mitchell and Chen as backup. We'll coordinate with the team headed to the commissioner's office." They moved swiftly through the building, Shadow leading the way with focused determination. As they approached the commissioner's office suite, they could hear the whir of shredders and urgent voices. Federal agents were already securing the outer office, but Shadow bypassed them, heading straight for a side door that led to a private conference room. The dog's behavior changed as soon as they entered. He began methodically working the room, his nose tracking something specific. He stopped at a wooden credenza, pawing at its base and letting out the same distinctive bark they'd heard in the courtroom. "Get it open," Agent Rodriguez ordered. Inside, they found several bankers' boxes, stuffed with documents. But it was what Shadow led them to next that made James's blood run cold. Behind a false panel in the wall was a safe containing dozens of USB drives, each labeled with dates and code names. As federal technicians began documenting and securing the evidence, James knelt beside Shadow, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his partner had helped uncover. What had started as his investigation into suspicious drug operations had led them to expose a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of city government. Sarah touched his shoulder gently. "You okay?" she asked softly. James looked up, at her, then back at Shadow, who maintained his alert vigilance even as chaos swirled around them. "They tried to bury the truth," he said finally, "tried to silence everyone who got close to exposing them, but they didn't count on a partner who could smell their lies." Shadow pressed against his leg, and James felt a surge of pride mixed with determination. They had uncovered the evidence, but the real fight was just beginning. Somewhere in the city, powerful people were realizing their carefully constructed empire was crumbling, and James knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. The sun was setting over the city skyline as James, Sarah, and Shadow made their way to the evidence lockup, where federal agents were cataloging the massive trove of documents and drives recovered from the commissioner's office. The building hummed with a tense energy. Too many officers had been implicated in the growing scandal, and trust was in short supply. Marcus sat surrounded by multiple computer screens, his fingers flying over keyboards as he worked to decrypt the USB drives. His face was illuminated by the harsh blue light of the monitors, casting deep shadows under his eyes. "These aren't just financial records," he announced as James and Sarah approached. "They've been documenting everything: blackmail material, payoff schedules, even contingency plans for if their operation was exposed." Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward and his body tensed. Before anyone could react, the power went out, plunging the room into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow across the space. "The servers!" Marcus shouted, frantically trying to keep his systems running on backup power. "Someone's trying to wipe them remotely!" James moved instinctively, guided by Shadow's low growl. The dog was facing the door, hackles raised. "Sarah, watch the evidence," he called out just as footsteps echoed in the hallway. Multiple sets, moving fast and with purpose. The door burst open, and 3 figures in tactical gear rushed in, their faces covered. Shadow launched into action without hesitation, taking down the first intruder with practiced precision. James engaged the second, his years of training taking over as they grappled. Sarah drew her weapon, covering Marcus as he desperately worked to prevent the data purge. "Federal agents are 2 minutes out," she shouted over the chaos. The third intruder made a break for the evidence tables, but Shadow was faster. The dog cut off their path, his threatening growl echoing off the walls. The intruder pulled a weapon, but before they could aim, James tackled them from behind. The gun skittered across the floor as they crashed into a desk. "The drives," Marcus called out triumphantly. "I've locked them out of the system." His victory was short-lived as more footsteps approached. But these belonged to Agent Rodriguez and her team, who quickly secured the scene and the would-be thieves. As the agents removed the intruders' masks, James felt his stomach turn. He recognized one of them, Officer Michael Drake from Cybercrimes, the same unit that had provided the supposedly ironclad digital evidence used to convict him. They weren't just here to destroy evidence, he realized aloud. They were trying to plant new files, make it look like the conspiracy evidence was fabricated. Agent Rodriguez nodded grimly. "And they nearly succeeded. If your partner hadn't sensed them coming." She glanced at Shadow, who had returned to James's side but remained alert, his eyes tracking every movement in the room. "This dog's instincts have been right at every turn. Makes me wonder if we shouldn't have K9 units assigned to our corruption task force. Sarah, who had been examining the intruder's equipment, held up a small device. Look at this. It's the same type of recording device Shadow found in James's jacket. They were going to plant more false evidence. She handed it to a federal technician for processing, her face troubled. How deep does this go? How many other innocent officers have they framed? James's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. You should have taken the fall, Morrison. Now everyone you care about is in danger. He showed it to Agent Rodriguez, his jaw tight with anger. They're getting desperate, she observed, which means we're getting close to something big. Shadow suddenly moved to the evidence table, his nose working intently over a specific file. James followed, trusting his partner's instincts implicitly. The file contained documents about the Riverside Renaissance project, including architectural plans and environmental impact studies. But as James flipped through the pages, Shadow's behavior became more insistent. Wait, Sarah said, looking over his shoulder. Look at the dates on these permits. They were approved months before the environmental studies were even conducted. And these signatures, she pointed to a series of authorizations. These are from Judge Blackwood, but he wasn't even assigned to the zoning board until after these were supposedly signed. Marcus called them over to his screens, where he had managed to decrypt one of the USB drives. It gets worse, he said, pulling up a series of emails. The development project isn't just about real estate. They're planning to build something else under those riverside properties, something that required deep foundations and access to the water. James studied the technical drawings that appeared on screen, his blood running cold as he understood the implications. They're creating an infrastructure for drug smuggling. The renovation project is just a cover. They're building a network of underground tunnels and water access points that would let them move product throughout the city undetected. Shadow whined softly, pressing against James's leg as if sensing his distress. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Corrupt officials at every level working together to transform the city's waterfront into a massive drug trafficking operation hidden behind legitimate development. We need to move fast, Agent Rodriguez declared, already making calls to her superiors. Once they realize their cleanup crew failed, they'll accelerate their plans. Morrison, you and Shadow know this operation better than anyone. We're going to need you both if we're going to stop this. James knelt beside his partner, drawing strength from Shadow's unwavering presence. They had uncovered the truth, but exposing it had painted targets on their backs. As emergency vehicles began arriving, outside, their sirens painting the walls with pulses of blue and red light, James knew the real battle was just beginning. Someone had already tried to frame him once. Now, they would be coming with everything they had. The safe house was a modest two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, chosen by the FBI for its strategic location and multiple escape routes. James sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by copies of the evidence they'd recovered, while Shadow maintained his vigil by the window. The dog's ears would prick up at every passing car, his training never allowing him to fully relax. While on protection duty, Sarah worked at a laptop across from him, cross-referencing construction permits with the suspicious financial transactions they'd uncovered. Look at this, she said, turning the screen toward him. Every time a legitimate business in the Riverside district filed for bankruptcy, one of these shell companies would buy the property within days, always at way below market value. James leaned forward, studying the pattern. They weren't just waiting for businesses to fail, he realized. They were forcing them out. The drug operations, the increased crime in the area, it was all orchestrated to drive down property values. Shadow suddenly lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his throat, seconds before Agent Rodriguez knocked on the door with the agreed-upon signal. "We've got movement," she announced as she entered, laying out surveillance photos on the table. "Major players are gathering at City Hall for an emergency closed-door session. Mayor Williams called it less than an hour ago. She pointed to several figures entering the building. We've identified Commissioner Parker, Judge Blackwood's wife, and representatives from the development company. James felt Shadow press against his leg, the dog's body tense with alertness. They're spooked, he said, studying the photos. The failed evidence raid, their cleanup crew in custody. They know we're closing in. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. The tech team finished analyzing those USB drives, she reported. They found detailed construction plans for the tunnel network. It's massive. Access points hidden in basement levels of all the new buildings, underwater channels for submarine drones. They're not just planning this, Agent Rodriguez interrupted, her face grim. Construction has already started. We found permits for utility work all along the riverside, approved months ago. They've been building their smuggling infrastructure right under our noses, disguised as routine maintenance. Shadow's growl deepened, and they all tensed as headlights swept across the window. But it was just Chen, arriving with the latest surveillance reports. They've got private security swarming the development sites, he reported, spreading out more photos. Heavy weapons, military-grade gear. Whatever they're protecting down there, they're willing to kill for it. James studied the security photos, his jaw tightening as he recognized some of the faces. These aren't just hired guns. Some of these guys are ex-police, former SWAT team members who suddenly resigned over the past year. He pointed to one particular figure. That's Eric Reeves. He was my supervisor before Reynolds. Took early retirement right after we started investigating those suspicious warehouse raids. Sarah pulled up more files on her laptop. The shell companies didn't just buy properties, she said. They've been hiring people too. Former law enforcement, military contractors, even some federal agents who left under suspicious circumstances. They're building their own private army. Agent Rodriguez's phone rang, and her expression darkened as she listened to the caller. They're moving tonight, she announced after hanging up. Our source inside City Hall says Mayor Williams just signed an executive order authorizing immediate demolition of several riverside buildings, citing urgent public safety concerns. They're going to destroy the evidence before we can stop them. Shadow stood up, his alertness infectious, as everyone in the room felt the shift in energy. This was what they'd been waiting for, the conspiracy forced into the open by their own desperation. How long do we have? James asked, already moving to gear up. The demolition crews are on standby, Rodriguez replied. They'll move as soon as darkness provides cover, less than 2 hours. They'll have the sites locked down, Chen warned. Security teams, corrupt cops, probably even some federal agents on their payroll. A frontal assault would be suicide. Shadow's ears suddenly perked up, and he moved to the table where the construction plans were spread out. His nose worked over the documents until he stopped at a particular blueprint, pawing at it insistently. James leaned in to study where Shadow was indicating. The old drainage tunnels, he said, a plan forming in his mind. They run under the entire Riverside district. Some of them are still active, but most were abandoned years ago. Sarah caught on immediately. They wouldn't be watching the old access points. We could get teams in right under their feet. Agent Rodriguez was already making calls, mobilizing tactical units and coordinating with trusted officers. We'll need every advantage we can get, she said. Morrison, can Shadow track through those tunnels? If they're already moving products through their new network? James looked at his partner, seeing the same determination in the dog's eyes that he felt in his own heart. He can track anything they're moving, but more importantly, he can alert us to any security waiting down there. As they geared up for the operation, James took a moment to kneel beside Shadow, checking his tactical vest and equipment. Ready for one more big case, boy? He asked softly. Shadow's tail wagged once, his posture confident and ready. They had started this investigation together, exposed the conspiracy together, and now they would end it together. Outside, the sun was setting over the city skyline, casting long shadows across the riverside district where corrupt power brokers thought they could bury their crimes in concrete and steel. But they hadn't counted on the unshakable bond between a detective and his canine partner. A bond that had already proven stronger than all their money, influence, and carefully laid plans. The old drainage tunnel entrance was barely visible beneath. Decades of overgrowth, its rusted gate hanging loose on corroded hinges. James and Shadow led the way, with Sarah, Chen, and a select team of federal agents following close behind. Their footsteps echoed off the curved walls as water dripped steadily from above, creating an eerie rhythm in the darkness. Shadow moved with practiced efficiency, his nose working constantly as they navigated the labyrinth of tunnels. The dog's specialized tactical vest was equipped with infrared markers, allowing the team to follow his movements even in near total darkness. James watched his partner's body language carefully, reading the subtle signs that had saved their lives countless times before. 200 meters ahead, we should hit the intersection with the new construction, Sarah whispered, checking the overlay of modern and historical tunnel maps on her tactical tablet. If their smuggling network is active, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Shadow's behavior was already changing, his movements becoming more focused as he picked up a scent. Suddenly, the dog froze, his ears forward and body rigid. James raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. Through their night vision gear, they could see what had triggered Shadow's alert. Fresh tool marks on the tunnel walls and the faint outline of a recently installed door trying to look decades old. Clever, Agent Rodriguez murmured. They're disguising their new access points to look like part of the original infrastructure. Anyone who stumbled down here would walk right past. Shadow's tail moved in a particular pattern. The silent signal he'd been trained to give when detecting narcotics. But there was something else in his behavior, a tension James recognized from their years working together. He's picking up multiple scents, James explained quietly. Not just drugs. People, and recently? As if confirming his words, they heard the faint echo of voices and movement from somewhere deeper in the tunnel network. Shadow's ears twitched, tracking the sounds with military precision. Chen's radio crackled softly with an update from the surface teams. Demolition crews are moving into position at all 3 targeted buildings. They're not waiting for full darkness. Time was running out. If they destroyed the buildings, they'd bury not just the evidence of their smuggling operation, but any chance of proving how deep the corruption reached. Shadow led them through a series of turns, each one bringing them closer to the heart of the operation. The old tunnels began to show more signs of recent activity, new electrical conduits hidden behind crumbling brick, modern ventilation systems disguised as rusted antiques, and sophisticated security cameras camouflaged to look like ancient utility fixtures. They've been down here for months, Sarah observed, documenting everything with her tactical camera, building this whole network while the city looked the other way. James nodded grimly. Every detail confirmed what they'd suspected. This wasn't just about drug smuggling. This was about creating a permanent shadow infrastructure beneath the city. They were approaching another intersection when Shadow suddenly dropped into a crouch, his muscles coiled with tension. James signaled the team to take cover just as voices echoed from around the corner. 2 armed guards passed by their position, their conversation carrying clearly in the tunnel's acoustics. "Mayor's getting antsy," one guard said. "Wants everything cleared out before the feds can get enough evidence for a warrant." The other guard laughed. "By morning, there won't be anything left to find, just some demolished buildings and a tragic accident involving a few nosy cops." James felt his blood run cold. They weren't just planning to destroy evidence. They were going to use the demolition to eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. Shadow pressed against his leg, and James drew strength from his partner's steady presence. They had to move fast, but they had to move smart. Agent Rodriguez gathered the team for a quick huddle. We've got multiple demolition sites and limited time. We need to split up. She outlined their positions on the tactical map. Morrison and Shadow take the main tunnel. Your K9's our best chance of finding their central operation. Mitchell and Chen head for the eastern access point. My team will cover the western approach. As they prepared to separate, Sarah caught James's arm. "Be careful," she said softly. "These people have already tried to destroy you once." James nodded, checking Shadow's vest one last time. They failed because they didn't understand what they were up against. A K9 and his handler. It's not just a partnership. It's a bond they can't break. Shadow's ears suddenly perked up, and his nose worked more intensely. Something had changed in the air currents flowing through the tunnels. James felt it too, a subtle shift in pressure that suggested large machinery starting up somewhere. Above them, the demolition was beginning. "Move out," Agent Rodriguez ordered, her voice tight with urgency. "Stay on comms. Report any contact immediately. Remember, we're not just fighting corrupt cops anymore. These people have everything to lose." The teams split up, each heading toward their assigned targets in the maze of tunnels. As James and Shadow moved deeper into the darkness, they could feel vibrations through the tunnel floor, heavy equipment being positioned above them. The clock was ticking. Somewhere in this underground labyrinth was the proof they needed to expose everyone involved in the conspiracy. But more importantly, there were people up there who wouldn't hesitate to bury them all to keep their secrets hidden. Shadow moved with heightened focus now, each step deliberate as he tracked whatever scent had caught his attention. James followed, trusting his partner's instincts as completely as he trusted his own training. They had survived frame-ups, assassination attempts, and betrayal together. Now they just had to survive one more night in the darkness beneath the city they had sworn to protect. The tunnel air grew thicker as James and Shadow approached what had to be the heart of the operation. The vibrations from the demolition equipment above had intensified, sending small cascades of dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. Shadow's pace quickened, his nose leading them toward a large steel door, cleverly weathered to look like it had been there for decades. The dog's behavior changed suddenly, a subtle shift that James recognized instantly. Shadow wasn't just tracking drugs anymore. He was detecting something that made his training kick into high alert. Before James could process the warning, voices echoed from behind the door, accompanied by the sound of heavy equipment being moved. "Get those servers wiped and loaded now," a familiar voice commanded. James's jaw tightened as he recognized Commissioner Parker's distinctive tone. "I want everything out before they bring those buildings down. Leave no trace that we were ever here." Shadow's ears flattened against his head, picking up on his partner's tension. James reached for his radio to alert the other teams, but Shadow's sudden rigid posture stopped him. The dog's head snapped to the left, toward a shadowy alcove. They'd just passed. Years of partnership had taught James to trust these warnings without hesitation. He pressed himself against the wall just as an armed figure emerged from the darkness. "It's clear down here, sir," the guard spoke into a radio, missing James and Shadow in the shadows. "No sign of..." His words cut off as Shadow launched into action, taking the man down with practiced efficiency before he could raise an alarm. James secured the guard, quickly confiscating his radio and weapons. The radio crackled to life. Team 2 report status. James's heart raced as he realized they'd just captured a crucial piece of their security network. The radio crackled again, more insistent this time. Shadow's ears perked up, his nose working overtime as more voices became audible from behind the steel door. "Something's wrong," they heard Commissioner Parker say. "Team 2's not responding. Start the destruct sequence now. We're not taking any chances." The sound of machinery intensified, accompanied by the distinct hum of electronic equipment being powered down. James keyed his own radio, knowing they'd lost the element of surprise. All teams converge on my position. They're destroying evidence and preparing to bring down the buildings. We need to move now. Shadow was already in position beside the door, his body tense and ready. The response was immediate. Eastern team, 2 minutes out, Sarah's voice came through. Western approach secured, Agent Rodriguez added, moving to your location. But they could hear the activity behind the door accelerating. They didn't have 2 minutes. Shadow's sudden bark was all the warning James needed. He dove for cover as the steel door burst open, armed men pouring out with military precision. But they weren't expecting a highly trained K9 unit. Shadow moved like a shadow himself, causing chaos in their formations, while James engaged from his protected position. The firefight was brief but intense. Shadow's presence disrupted their carefully planned retreat, forcing them to split their attention between the attacking dog and James's covering fire. By the time Sarah and Chen arrived, with their team, 3 guards were down, and the others had retreated deeper into the facility. They're cornered, Chen observed, checking the fallen guards. This is their command center, no other way out. But James saw Shadow's behavior and knew something was wrong. The dog was trying to tell them something, pawing at the floor and whining in a way his partner had never seen before. "Wait!" James called out as Agent Rodriguez's team prepared to breach. He knelt beside Shadow, trusting his partner's instincts. The dog's paw scraped at a specific spot on the floor, and James noticed something odd about the way the water was flowing around that area. It's not just a command center, he realized aloud. This whole section is rigged to flood. They're going to drown all the evidence and anyone down here with it. As if confirming his words, they heard massive pumps roaring to life somewhere in the darkness. Sarah's tactical tablet suddenly lit up with warnings. The demolition charges above. They've moved up the timeline. They're not just bringing down the buildings. They're going to collapse the entire tunnel network. The implications hit them all at once. This wasn't just about destroying evidence anymore. This was about burying everyone who knew the truth. Shadow barked sharply, pulling James toward a different corridor than the one the guards had taken. "He's got something," James called out, "a different way in." The dog's behavior was unmistakable. He'd found another access point, one that might let them outflank the cornered conspirators. Agent Rodriguez made a quick decision. Mitchell, take half the team and head up to stop those demolition charges. Chen, coordinate with surface units to evacuate anyone in the collapse zone. Morrison, you, Shadow, and my team follow that scent. Whatever your partners found, it might be our only shot. As they moved out, water began seeping into the tunnel from multiple points. The whole system was being systematically flooded. Decades-old drainage tunnels being turned into a tomb for anyone who dared expose the truth. But Shadow led them forward with unwavering confidence, following a trail that only he could detect. Through the rising water, James felt the familiar surge of pride and trust in his partner. Together, they'd exposed the conspiracy from that first moment in the courtroom. Now, as water rose around their feet and the walls trembled with impending destruction, they had one last chance to finish what they'd started. Shadow had never led him wrong, and James knew, whatever his partner had found, it would be the key to bringing down not just a corrupt operation, but everyone behind it. Shadow's pace quickened through the rising water, leading them down a narrow maintenance passage that curved away from the main tunnel system. The dog moved with absolute certainty, even as the water level crept higher and distant explosions sent tremors through the concrete walls. James and Agent Rodriguez's team followed close behind, trusting the K9's instincts that had proven infallible throughout this case. The radio crackled to life. Team 2, report status. James's heart raced as he realized they'd just captured a crucial piece of their security network. The radio crackled again, more insistent this time. Shadow's ears perked up, his nose working overtime, as more voices became audible from behind the steel door. "Something's wrong," they heard Commissioner Parker say. Team 2's not responding. Start the destruct sequence now. We're not taking any chances. The sound of machinery intensified, accompanied by the distinct hum of electronic equipment being powered down. James keyed his own radio, knowing they'd lost the element of surprise. All teams converge on my position. They're destroying evidence and preparing to bring down the buildings. We need to move now. Shadow was already in position beside the door, his body tense and ready. The response was immediate. Eastern team, 2 minutes out, Sarah's voice came through. Western approach secured, Agent Rodriguez added, moving to your location. But they could hear the activity behind the door accelerating. They didn't have 2 minutes. Shadow's sudden bark was all. The warning James needed. He dove for cover as the steel door burst open, armed men pouring out with military precision. But they weren't expecting a highly trained K9 unit. Shadow moved like a shadow himself, causing chaos in their formations, while James engaged from his protected position. The firefight was brief but intense. Shadow's presence disrupted their carefully planned retreat, forcing them to split their attention between the attacking dog and James's covering fire. By the time Sarah and Chen arrived, with their team, 3 guards were down, and the others had retreated deeper into the facility. They're cornered, Chen observed, checking the fallen guards. This is their command center, no other way out. But James saw Shadow's behavior and knew something was wrong. The dog was trying to tell them something, pawing at the floor and whining in a way his partner had never seen before. "Wait!" James called out as Agent Rodriguez's team prepared to breach. He knelt beside Shadow, trusting his partner's instincts. The dog's paw scraped at a specific spot on the floor, and James noticed something odd about the way the water was flowing around that area. It's not just a command center, he realized aloud. This whole section is rigged to flood. They're going to drown all the evidence and anyone down here with it. As if confirming his words, they heard massive pumps roaring to life somewhere in the darkness. Sarah's tactical tablet suddenly lit up with warnings. The demolition charges above, they've moved up the timeline. They're not just bringing down the buildings, they're going to collapse the entire tunnel network. The implications hit them all at once. This wasn't just about destroying evidence anymore. This was about burying everyone who knew the truth. Shadow barked sharply, pulling James toward a different corridor than the one the guards had taken. "He's got something," James called out. "A different way in." The dog's behavior was unmistakable. He'd found another access point, one that might let them outflank the cornered conspirators. "They're starting the demolition," Chen's voice crackled through their radios. "Sarah's team is engaging the crews, but they've got armed security up there. It's a war zone." Another explosion rocked the tunnel, closer this time, sending cascades of debris raining down from above. Shadow suddenly stopped at what appeared to be a dead end, but his behavior told James otherwise. The dog scratched intensely at a section of wall that looked just like any other part of the aged concrete. "Here," James called out, running his hands over the surface. "There's a seam. It's disguised, but it's here." Agent Rodriguez quickly deployed her team. "Find the mechanism. Whatever's behind this wall, they tried damn hard to hide it." As they searched, water continued rising steadily around their knees. The pumps were working faster now, filling the tunnel system with alarming speed. Shadow's barking took on a new urgency as he focused on a particular spot near the floor. James knelt in the water, feeling where his partner indicated. His fingers found a small irregularity in the concrete. A hidden panel that, when pressed, triggered a mechanical grinding sound. The false wall began to slide aside, revealing a modern security door behind it. "This is it," Agent Rodriguez breathed, studying the sophisticated locking mechanism. "This isn't some temporary setup. They built this to last." Before they could figure out how to breach it, Shadow's head snapped up, his ears forward. Through the door, they could hear voices and the sound of equipment being moved. "Last servers are wiped," someone reported. "Physical documents are shredded." Flood the chamber and seal it up. James recognized Commissioner Parker's voice again, tighter now, with barely controlled panic. No one can ever find this place. Shadow's growl deepened as the water rose past their waists. They were running out of time. Agent Rodriguez's tech specialist moved forward with a breaching device, but James held up his hand, watching Shadow closely. The dog wasn't focused on the door anymore. His attention had shifted to something above it. "Wait," James said, following Shadow's gaze. "Look at the ventilation duct." Half hidden in the shadows, a modern air handling system had been installed alongside the original tunnel ventilation. Shadow's training had picked up on something coming through those ducts, probably the same thing that had led him here in the first place. "We can't wait," Rodriguez insisted as another explosion shook the tunnel. "That door's reinforced steel. It'll take precious minutes to breach, and we don't have minutes." James looked at Shadow, saw the certainty in his partner's stance, and made a decision. "We don't need the door," he said, pointing to the vent. "Shadow can smell the moving evidence through that system. There has to be another way in, a maintenance access point." The dog's tail wagged once, confirming his handler's intuition. "Chen," James called into his radio, "check the building plans. Look for anything connected to ventilation or climate control." Seconds ticked by as Chen searched, the water now reaching their chests. "Got it!" he finally responded. "Maintenance room 1 level up, connects to the original air handling system. But James, that section of tunnel is scheduled for demolition in less than 5 minutes." Shadow was already moving, leading them to a utility ladder they'd passed. Earlier, the dog took the rungs with practiced ease, his specialized vest allowing him to climb alongside his human partners. They emerged into a smaller tunnel, this one still relatively dry but filled with the deep rumble of demolition equipment above. 3 minutes, Sarah's voice warned through their radios. "We've held off most of the demolition crews, but they've got charges set on automated timers. Building's going to come down no matter what." Shadow raced ahead, leading them to a heavy metal door marked Environmental Systems. Inside, they found exactly what they needed. Access panels to the ventilation system, including the modern additions that had been secretly installed. Through the ducts, they could hear the activity in the command center below. 1 minute! The warning barely registered as James helped Agent Rodriguez's team remove the access panels. Shadow's behavior had changed again, the intense focus of a K9 who had located his target. The dog knew exactly where they needed to. "Go! 30 seconds!" Sarah's voice was desperate now. Below them they heard Commissioner Parker, "Seal it up! Get out now!" Followed by the sound of the heavy security door closing. But they weren't trying to get through that door anymore. "All units clear the building," Sarah commanded. "Charges are hot." The walls around them began to shake as the first charges detonated somewhere above. But Shadow had already located what they needed, a maintenance shaft that led directly into the hidden command center. As the building above them began to collapse, James looked at his partner, saw the same determination that had driven them. Since that first moment in the courtroom, through false evidence, assassination attempts, and now a building designed to bury them, Shadow had never wavered. The dog's loyalty and instincts had led them here, to this final moment. "Go!" Agent Rodriguez ordered as chunks of ceiling began to fall. Shadow didn't hesitate, plunging into the shaft with James right behind him. The rest of the team followed. As the world crashed down around them, they had one shot at this, one chance to reach the evidence before it was destroyed forever. And as always, they were following a K9's unfailing instincts into the heart of darkness. The maintenance shaft opened into organized chaos. Commissioner Parker and his remaining loyalists were desperately trying to finish destroying evidence. As water poured in from multiple sources, servers were being systematically fried, documents fed into industrial shredders, and hard drives crushed under hydraulic presses. But they hadn't counted on a K9 unit dropping in from above. Shadow landed first, immediately launching into action with military precision. His sudden appearance sent the criminals scrambling, their carefully planned destruction dissolving into panic. James and the federal team followed, emerging into the command center just as Parker reached for an emergency protocol panel on the wall. "Federal agents!" Rodriguez shouted over the chaos of rushing water and blaring alarms. "Step away from the controls!" But Parker's hand was already moving, pressing a sequence of buttons that made the entire chamber shudder. Above them, the demolition charges continued their programmed sequence, sending devastating vibrations through the structure. Shadow's focus never wavered. While the humans dealt with Parker and his men, the dog moved with singular purpose toward a specific section of the room. His behavior caught James's attention immediately. This wasn't his normal alert for drugs or explosives. This was something different, something they'd trained for but rarely encountered. "He's alerting on electronics," James called out, following his partner through the rising water. Shadow led him to a rack of servers that looked different from the others, newer, more sophisticated. While the rest of the equipment was being destroyed, these machines were being carefully preserved, prepared for transport. "Those servers stay intact," Parker shouted, his composed facade finally cracking. He drew a concealed weapon, but Shadow was faster. The dog launched himself through the water, taking the commissioner down before he could aim. The splash of their impact mixed with the sound of gunfire as the federal team engaged the remaining guards. James reached the servers just as another explosion rocked the chamber. Chunks of concrete crashed into the water around them as the building above continued its controlled demolition. But Shadow's behavior had changed again. He was pawing at something beneath the server rack, something hidden under the rising water. "There's a compartment here," James shouted, reaching into the murky water where Shadow indicated. His fingers found a recessed handle, and with the dog's help, he heaved open a hidden floor panel. Inside, protected in waterproof cases, they found what the conspirators had been most desperate to hide: dozens of hard drives and documents that would expose everything. The whole operation. Agent Rodriguez breathed, helping James secure the evidence. Money trails, blackmail material, everything they needed to control the city. Another explosion sent more debris crashing down. The chamber's reinforced ceiling was beginning to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading ominously above them. "We need to move," James shouted. "This place is coming down." But Shadow was already ahead of them, leading the way to their escape route. The dog's training kicked in as he guided them through the flooding chamber, finding the safest path through falling debris and live electrical equipment. They were almost to the maintenance shaft when James heard Sarah's voice through his radio, barely audible through static. "James, the demolition sequence, it's accelerating. They've overridden the delays. You've got less than 60 seconds. The water was chest-deep now, making every step a struggle as they fought to keep the evidence. In cases above the surface, Shadow suddenly changed direction, barking sharply to get their attention. The maintenance shaft they'd used to enter was now blocked by fallen concrete, but the dog had found another way out, an emergency evacuation route that the conspirators had planned to use themselves. "Follow the K9!" Rodriguez ordered as the ceiling gave way behind them. They pushed through the flooding tunnel, guided by Shadow's unwavering instincts. The dog led them through a series of turns, each one taking them further from the collapsing command center and closer to safety. Just when it seemed they might not make it, light appeared ahead. An emergency exit disguised as a utility maintenance hole. They emerged into the pre-dawn air just as the final charges detonated. The ground shook violently as the buildings above the tunnel network collapsed, sending a cloud of dust billowing through the streets. Sarah was waiting with backup. "Teams," relief visible on her face as she helped pull them clear of the destruction. "The evidence?" she asked urgently. James held up the waterproof cases, then knelt beside Shadow, who stood alert and proud, despite being soaked and covered in concrete dust. "We got it all," he said, scratching his partner's ears. "Every server, every document they tried to hide, Shadow found their secret vault. The one place they weren't willing to destroy. Everything we need to expose the whole operation." The dog's tail wagged once, his mission finally complete. As federal agents secured the scene and medical teams treated the injured, James watched the sun rise over his city. The conspiracy that had nearly destroyed his life, that had tried to bury the truth beneath concrete and steel, had finally been exposed. And it had all started in that courtroom with a loyal K9 who refused to let an innocent man go down. "Good boy," James whispered to his partner, their bond stronger than ever. Shadow pressed against his leg, both of them watching as Commissioner Parker and his conspirators were led away in handcuffs. The long nightmare was over. Justice had prevailed, and once again, it was the unshakable bond between a handler and his K9 that had made the difference between truth and lies, between right and wrong, between justice and corruption. The media would soon descend, the headlines would blare, and the city would begin its long process of healing. But for James and Shadow, all that mattered was that they had faced the darkness together, and together they had brought light to the truth. Their partnership, tested by fire and strengthened by adversity, had proven more powerful than all the money and corruption their enemies could muster. 3 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly renovated K9 training facility. James stood before a group of fresh police recruits, Shadow sitting alertly by his side. The evidence they'd recovered from beneath the Riverside district had led to over 100 arrests, including judges, politicians, and high-ranking law enforcement officials. The city was still recovering, but change was finally coming. The bond between a handler and their K9 partner, James addressed the recruits, his hand resting on Shadow's head, "isn't just about training or following procedures. It's about trust, instinct, and an understanding that goes beyond words." Shadow's ears perked up as if emphasizing the point, drawing smiles from the young officers. Sarah, now heading the department's reformed internal affairs division, leaned against the doorframe, watching the presentation. The past months had been intense. Countless hours of testimony, mountains of evidence to process, and a complete restructuring of the police department. But seeing James and Shadow back in action, helping to train the next generation, made it all worth it. "Your K9 partners will see things you miss, sense things you can't," James continued, nodding to the German shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and other service dogs paired with the recruits. "They'll risk their lives for you without hesitation. But, most importantly, they'll never compromise their integrity. A properly trained K9 can't be corrupted, can't be bought, and will never stay silent in the face of wrongdoing." The evidence Shadow had helped uncover had exposed more than just the Riverside conspiracy. It had revealed dozens of cases where innocent officers had been framed, where investigations had been deliberately derailed, where justice had been perverted by those sworn to uphold it. The process of reviewing and overturning those false convictions was ongoing, with James and Shadow playing key roles in the investigations. "Take Marcus Zhang," James gestured to a familiar face in the back of the room. The former forensics technician who had helped decrypt the crucial evidence was now heading the department's new digital forensics unit. "He'll tell you that technology can be manipulated, evidence can be planted, and systems can be hacked. But a K9's instincts, those are pure, unchangeable, and absolutely reliable." Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward, and his tail wagged as Agent Rodriguez entered the training room. The FBI had maintained a strong presence in the city during the cleanup, with Rodriguez personally overseeing the formation of a new joint task force dedicated to rooting out corruption in law enforcement. "Your star witness is looking good," she remarked to James, scratching Shadow behind the ears. The dog had received multiple commendations for his role in exposing the conspiracy, including a special recognition from the FBI's K9 division. His success had led to a new program integrating K9 units into anti-corruption investigations nationwide. After the presentation, James and Shadow walked through the renovated precinct, now barely recognizable from the corrupt institution it had been just months ago. Officers nodded respectfully as they passed. The story of how a K9's loyalty had brought down an entire criminal enterprise had become department legend. "Officer Morrison!" a young voice called out. They turned to see Tommy Chen, Officer Chen's 10-year-old son, running toward them with excitement. "Is it true that Shadow can smell bad guys through walls?" James laughed, watching as Shadow gently accepted the boy's enthusiastic petting. "He can smell a lot of things, Tommy, but more importantly, he knows right from wrong. That's something no amount of training can teach." In the K9 unit's new outdoor training area, several handlers were putting their partners through certification exercises. James watched them work, remembering his own early days with Shadow. "The department's different now," Sarah said, joining them in the yard. "Better, stronger, and it all started because of a dog who wouldn't let his partner go down for crimes. He didn't commit." Shadow's attention suddenly focused on a point beyond the fence, his posture alert but not tense. Moments later, a familiar figure appeared. Judge Harrison, who had recently been appointed to oversee the newly established Police Integrity Commission. The judge had become a frequent visitor to the training facility, particularly interested in how K9 units could be integrated into anti-corruption measures. "Remarkable animals," Harrison commented, watching the training exercises. "In all my years on the bench, I've seen every kind of evidence challenged, every testimony questioned. But a K9's alert, that's pure, unimpeachable truth." He turned to James and Shadow. "You two showed us that sometimes the most powerful force for justice isn't in our laws or our courts. It's in the unbreakable bond between partners who refuse to give up on each other." As the sun began to set over the city, James and Shadow made their usual patrol route, now expanded to include regular checks of the Riverside district. The demolished buildings were being replaced with legitimate developments, the corrupt network beneath them filled in and sealed forever. But the lessons learned, they would never be forgotten. Shadow stopped at their usual spot overlooking the river, his keen senses still alert for anything out of place. James knelt beside his partner, feeling the same pride and gratitude that had filled him every day since that moment in the courtroom when Shadow had first exposed the truth. "We did it, boy," he said softly, watching the city lights begin to twinkle on. "We showed them all what real partnership means." Shadow pressed against his side, his presence as steady and reliable as ever. Together, they had faced corruption, danger, and death itself, and together they would continue to serve, protect, and uphold the truth. One case, one day, one unshakable bond at a time. As James and Shadow continued their evening patrol, their story had become more than just a tale of justice prevailing. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, loyalty and truth would find a way to shine through. The department had established an annual Shadow Award for K9 units who demonstrated exceptional service in uncovering corruption or protecting their partners. The city itself had changed. The Riverside district, once a symbol of corruption and greed, was being transformed into a community space, with parks, legitimate businesses, and a new K9 training facility named in Shadow's honor. The underground tunnels that had once hidden so many secrets were now sealed, but their story served as a powerful reminder of what could happen when good people stayed silent. At home, Shadow's bed had been moved from the corner of James's living room to right beside his own bedroom door. The nightmares of prison cells and betrayal had faded, replaced by the comfort of knowing his partner was always there, always vigilant, always loyal. Sarah had become a regular visitor, often bringing case files for their review and treats for Shadow. The bond that had formed between them during the investigation had grown stronger, built on shared experiences and mutual respect. Even Chen would joke about how Shadow had played matchmaker while saving the city. As they finished their patrol, Ruth, a young girl, pointed excitedly from across the street. "Mom, look, it's the hero dog!" Shadow's tail wagged gently at the recognition, but his focus never wavered from his duty. James smiled, remembering what he'd told the recruits earlier that day. It wasn't about the commendations or the headlines. It was about the unbreakable bond between partners who would risk everything for what was right. The sun had fully set now, casting long shadows across their path as they headed home. Shadow walked perfectly in step with James, just as he had done that first day they'd been paired together, just as he'd done in that courtroom when everything changed, and just as he would continue to do for years to come. Their story had started with a desperate plea for one last goodbye. It had become a testament to the power of loyalty, truth, and the extraordinary bond between a canine and his handler. As they walked home under the stars, James knew that while the city had many heroes who helped expose the truth, none were more deserving of the title than the faithful partner walking beside him. Shadow had proven that sometimes the strongest voice for justice doesn't speak at all. It barks,